Thank you for coming and being here in person. For those folks who are online, we're really grateful that you're here. We're excited that we can provide these kinds of events for you. Bradley's visit actually came at a really serendipitous moment. I've been receiving a number of queries as Director of Writing Programs about how to help students and faculty manage the workload. When we get a lot of papers, we teach a lot of classes. How do we make sure that we're doing that work efficiently so that we can maintain our investments in all of the other things that make our professional lives feel rewarding and exciting. I was trying to figure out how to actively manage that work, and then I got an email from her saying, Bradley's coming. It's like, well, Bradley's going to do a much better job than anything that we can do in-house. So if you don't know, this is Bradley Dilger. This is the Director of Writing Programs at Purdue University, someone that I deeply admire and deeply respect. For a number of reasons, intellectually capacious, but deeply, deeply compassionate. And we're so grateful that you're here. We're looking forward to hearing your talk today about how to respond to student writing. So thank you for being here.
Thank you for those very, very kind words. Just a little bit about me, so you have some background. And in case you're coming in later, you can figure out who I am with the photograph taken by one of my graduate students the day she was ordained as an Episcopalian minister, which is kind of cool. So I do lots of stuff in writing studies all over the place, in part because I like to, in part because Purdue needs it. They need folks that can be versatile. So I got my PhD from Florida in 2003. I was at Western Illinois for 11 years. Now I'm at Purdue. You may have heard of some of my research projects, maybe not. I'm really proud of CROW, the Corpus and Repository of Writing. Really, really student and participant-driven project where we've taken a corpus and a repository and stuck them together, which is pretty cool. So anyway, not to do too much self-promotion, just to give you a little intro. So here's what I want to do today. We'll read and discuss a little writing. We'll talk about inclusive ways so we can respond to student writing. We'll look at some metaphors and think about how metaphors shape the way we respond. This is important, personas. And then managing the workload, including tricks of the trade and designing assignments for response. Try to shoehorn a break in here, not a very long one, but just 5 or 10 minutes. And I've got, like I said, I've got a couple things to look at and a couple activities we can do. So what I was thinking is folks in person can talk among themselves if they want. We can all do the activities individually. Folks that are online can use the chat to share ideas. Again, the level of formality isn't going to be superbly high here. So this is the first thing I want to start with. I want to start with the first page of a literacy narrative, right? And this is the first page of a literacy narrative that was turned in a class at Purdue a couple years ago. Let's just read this and talk a little bit about how we respond to it. And then there's a second assignment on the same page that we'll discuss later if we have time. And obviously I'm using short assignments so we have more time for conversation. So folks in the Zoom, if you shared the screen, you should be able to, or if you've actually loaded up the slide deck, excuse me, you should be able to click on that link. I'll put it in the chat as well. All right, in person, online, what do you think? How would you respond to this literacy narrative? This is the first page of a 3-page literacy narrative. What are you going to say? I know, right? This is kind of a challenge. There's some interesting things happening here.
Call the Dean of Students office.
Maybe that's not the first move to make. Yeah, so I'm going to go ahead one slide because then we can have stuff on screen. It might be a little easier for you to read if you're in Zoom or even if you're in here. All right, trapped in darkness is the only sensual feeling I recall from Friday the 10th of this month. I was jailed in this scene for long hours and it seemed immortal. Myself wanted to run away from it. Wow, really, really florid language here. Why? Well, because this was the prompt. Look what the prompt asks the person to do. Dramatize this experience and reflect upon its significance. And this student took that extremely literally. Right? So this is one of the challenges of response is we can write a prompt that we think does one thing and students read it a completely different way. And that could be because of their background. Maybe the student was in theater and they think that they can call upon their talents to do it. Maybe it's somebody who's a second language speaker of English who doesn't get the connotations of dramatize the same way that we do. Right? There's all sorts of different directions that we could go in with this prompt here. And so it isn't that this is a bad prompt, right? It's actually quite a good one because it sets up the rhetorical situation and, you know, it reaches out to the students in certain ways, right? I think it assumes that there's significance to talk about, which is great. But again, sometimes students can latch onto one thing that we don't expect and go in a direction that makes our job to respond very, very difficult. Right. So anybody want to venture something? What would you do? Yeah.
Actually, I would ask the student to tell me the story verbally.
Okay.
In the words that they would normally use.
All right. So I'll repeat the answer. I'm sorry, I don't remember your name.
Cecilia.
Cecilia says she would ask the student to explain the story in words that they would normally use. Right, which I like because then it sets up a situation where you can say, okay, now we can talk about the rhetorical choices that you're making and why you're making them. And maybe it is that you're cueing on dramatize in a certain way that isn't productive. Maybe you're just misunderstanding the level of drama that might work for a literacy narrative. Maybe you can work up to this drama, right? Lots of different ways to do that. That's good. That's a nice way to reach out. What else? Any other ways you might respond? Besides calling the Office of Students, the Dean of Students, Pacheco.
I might not tell the because I'm not really sure what's happening here, right? Like Cecilia, so I might say something like, "Hey,
yeah,
are you okay?"
Yeah,
and then maybe we find out what happened here.
Yeah, there is.
Really sure.
Right. Right. This could be concerning.
Yeah.
This could be
a total story. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. So again, the response, just to make sure folks hear it who are in Zoom, is you ask the student, "Are you okay?" You know, express some concern and some compassion for the student. So, you know, one other possibility is this needs a little bit more work on our end, right? Our assignment overview, just for whatever reason, is highlighting the wrong thing. And, I mean, maybe just switching the order would work, right? Or maybe not putting this in bold, right? And literally, this is a screen cap from the assignment sheet. So this is how it went out to the students. So again, the point here is just to get you thinking about lots of different ways to go. Yeah. And that's great, Derek, right? Ask about the definition of literacy, broadly defined, that the student is working with. Cecilia's response was similar, right? Go back to the student and try to understand how they're responding to the prompt. Okay, so I like all this. This makes a lot of sense. Okay, so this is one of the things that we have to ask ourselves constantly. What are the expectations that we have and how are we communicating them to students? Because there might be a miscommunication on this prompt. There might be communication coming from the student who's reaching out to you or is confiding in you in a way that shows trust for you, right? So this is really complicated. It always is, right? And I don't think we can make it easy, but I do think we can make it more systematic. And there's some things we can do at the same time to make sure that we reach every student as well as we can within our limits, right? Because we all have, you know, a lot of students and very little time, of course. At Purdue, these are the prompts that we use in our syllabi. All of our first-year writing syllabi have the same outcomes. Familiar situation, I'm sure. We have one whole outcome out of 6 that speaks to feedback, which I really love because it enables us to spend a lot of time on it in class. And so you can see here, we ask students to evaluate writing. We ask them to think about using comments to revise. Collaboration is included. I love this because this first thing, provide constructive feedback, is the actual outcome. And then these are the student learning objectives that work forward. So this is always one place to start. Do what your outcomes say. What do your outcomes say? All right, here's a couple of them. All right, and there's some interesting stuff here. Okay? Write and revise drafts and integrate feedback from peers, teachers, and other readers. This is very compact. There's a lot happening in that one outcome. Okay? But there's expression for peer feedback, right? Other readers, outside audiences, is implicated there, caught up in the response. Here are the ones from 107. I really liked this last one. Demonstrate resilience during the drafting, revision, and reflection process. What would it mean to be a resilient giver or receiver of feedback? Think about that when I ask you about personas and metaphors later. Right? What does it mean to be a resilient giver or getter of feedback? So if you haven't taken a moment to reflect on the outcomes that your program uses, that's a nice place to start. Not because you have to lockstep abide by them, but these are things that your students can pay attention to, and there are things you can emphasize in line with these things that have credibility. And so you can say to students, here's why we're doing what we're doing. And I think a lot of effective response is just that level of communication, right? What are the expectations? How do you communicate them with students? Where do they come from? Do students really understand where you're coming from and what you're trying to get them to do? Right? Or help them do, to be very specific. This is the point that I think we can't make enough. Less is more. Especially in new folks, I see people thinking that the more they comment, the better. And the problem is, of course, time management. Especially for folks that are new at this, it takes them 3, 4, 5 times as long just to read the set of work compared to us, who are, I think most of us are pretty experienced here, at least in this room. And that can be deeply frustrating for new folks, because to put that on top of a response kind of like this, and you can have a real problem, and people can get really, really caught up on the wrong foot. So I start on day one teaching new instructors, graduate students or people who are coming from another field, teaching people who are literature faculty who are teaching composition after doing literature for a long time. This is where I start. Here's a slide from the pre-semester writing program meetings that we have. You guys may do this. We have a meeting, all hands, in person and in Zoom, at the start of every semester. I put this up in spring 2020, which of course got really interesting about 2 months later. I recycled a lot of this in fall 2022 and a lot of it again in spring 2024. Because over and over again, I see people doing what's highlighted in the does this mean part here. And I'll skip ahead a little bit. Trying to respond to every part of every assignment, addressing all the errors for every student in equal amounts, regardless of the time commitment required. Right? People who, they know they're not supposed to do this, but they sort of default to it anyway. So if there's one thing you take away from what we're talking about today, it would be this quote from Nancy Summers, who's studied student writing more than all of us combined, and responding to student writing more than all of us combined. Many veteran readers find the experience of responding to student writing to be one of constantly deciding not to comment on less important issues. Such restraint allows you to focus your energies on just a few important points, and also tends to yield a cleaner and more easily intelligible message for students. Okay? The anecdote I like to tell about this is when I was a graduate student and I gave somebody extensive comments on a paper, they threw it in the trash as they walked out of the room. Which wasn't very nice, but what it tells me is that people don't always respond the way that you think that they're going to respond to you. Hence the communication, hence expectations, and hence less. Right? Hence less, because people are, and then Summers has years of research that supports this, people are more likely to engage the comments and work with them and try to actually apply them to their writing if they feel they understand them and can prioritize them and they're not overwhelmed by them. Right? The stereotypical instance is the red ink all over the page, right? Well, I don't think most of us do that anymore. Most of us are doing this online, right? But the amount of feedback still can overwhelm us and it can overwhelm students. So I want to encourage you to move away from that. Here's what I always say. This is the official Purdue Writing Program language here. Provide useful, relevant, and timely written feedback that helps your students become better writers. If you've ever worked in a writing center, you can see the writing center studies at work here. I work a lot with Harry Denny, who's wonderful and generous, and he and I have talked a lot about doing this type of work. Useful, relevant, and timely. All three of those are really important. Okay. Can you get 2? If you can only get 2, I would pick timely and relevant. Well, you never know if it's useful or not until you talk to students about it. All right, so any questions about this exordium? Less is more. Less is more is the first takeaway here. Now let's shift gears and talk about being inclusive when we're responding to student writing. And again, this is the question I think we want to ask, and Harry Denny and I have done workshops on this, so part of this is his language. Do our approaches to response welcome all students to a community of writers? Some of your responses in the room have already done that, where you're expressing concern for the student, where you're going to them, you're asking them for information. That is very welcoming. That's wonderful. Right? So all students, and that's hard because we're at large public institutions. We have incredibly, incredibly diverse students. One of the things I tell folks at Purdue, we have many, many, many high-achieving students at Purdue. They're wonderful writers. They come in incredibly well prepared. They have internships in high school. Like, they have a longer resume coming out of high school than I did when I came out of college. But one of the things that does is it raises the bar for helping the students that are not that well prepared, because those students can very easily fall for the cracks and feel like they're not part of that community with the 2-page resume the day they walk in the door. So what can you do to highlight the successes that students are having, no matter how small, no matter if that's all you have? It's just a couple successes. I think that's really, really important. I lean very heavily on the work of Megan McIntyre here. She's at Arkansas. I think her stuff is absolutely fabulous. I've got a link to it in the slide deck, and I can just pull it up here. And I've picked some of the things that I think are really important. Strongly recommend that you take a look at this. I've tried to highlight the things that I think are the most important and talk about those a little bit. But I also wanted to give McIntyre a shout out for other stuff that she's got. And again, this is linked up here. All sorts of interesting things that she's just giving away about teaching writing, running writing programs, being a writing instructor. So shout out for her generosity and just incredible smartness. I mean, this person's really smart. So here are the things that I think Megan shares with us that are really important. And you don't have to do all these things. That's another thing I like about what she's suggesting. She's giving you a toolbox. Include students in developing feedback materials. Has anybody done this? I watched a graduate student do this the other day. They had an assignment, and she gave them the assignment, and the students took out highlighters, and they highlighted all over the assignment, and they developed a rubric, and they picked the point values, and they came up with 4-point schemes and 5 criteria and voted on them in one class period. It was great. At the end of the class, what happens? The students have read the heck out of the assignment. And they're invested in the rubric, too. I mean, they were arguing about it. Really, really cool to see that. McIntyre's got some really good suggestions for that on that resources page to dig into much more detail. So I want to highlight that one. The second one's really important for our institutions. Don't reinscribe a single way of writing. Because, again, we work with many, many students from many, many types of communities, many language backgrounds. Especially in first-year composition, we have the room to do lots and lots of different types of writing. Do it. Right? Do it. Help students become better writers, help students achieve standards that apply in certain communities, right? Help them learn correctness, but don't mandate it. Don't put your version of it on them. Again, like Cecilia said, what do you want? Like helping students express to you what communities they value, then you can say, okay, cool, that community values this, that's where you want to be. You're writing for a community that doesn't value the way you're writing. Let's talk about that. And I really like to cast it in terms of value. It's not that it's wrong, it's that it's not valued in that context. Okay? The last one I think is really great. Asking students to discuss their rhetorical choices. This is a research method I've used a ton in my work studying writing transfer. Odell Goswami and Harrington's discourse-based interview, where they ask people about the rhetorical choices they make. So they would, just to use this as a discourse-based interview thing, they would ask me why I said developing here instead of writing. They would ask me why I said generous instead of kind. You ask people about those low-level rhetorical choices, what happens? Well, they have to think about it. They have to, come up with their intention. But it also helps them understand their own tacit knowledge. And a lot of folks that we work with come to the table with lots of tacit knowledge that they just, if you point it out to them, wow, it helps them a lot. So I try to do that whether I'm studying, how people collaborate or digging into research methods, or teaching first-year writing, or working with graduate students. So again, I encourage you to dig into McIntyre's stuff, especially this, but some other things that are really useful too. One way to do this is to think about the metaphors we bring to the table when we're responding to writing. How do the metaphors shape your feedback? Right? Now, I'll bring my research and transfer here a little bit. These are 9 of the 26 metaphors that Neil Baird and I have cataloged in research on writing transfer. How do we take something from one context and motivate it in a second context? Writing for your church, can you use that at school? Writing that you did when you were in a student organization, can you put that to work when you actually go to the workplace? That's writing transfer. If we talk about that as movement, then what we're doing is taking knowledge from one place to another unchanged. That's very different than if we talk about it as negotiation, right? Negotiation highlights the interpersonal. It highlights the power. It highlights that there are stakes involved, right? And I'm not saying any one of these is right or wrong. I think they all happen in certain contexts. But the metaphors that we use are going to guide the way we imagine what we're doing when we're responding. Here's some metaphors that I've used to describe my work as a writing program administrator. Yes, some of these are humorous. We have a career state legislator in Lafayette, Indiana, named Sheila Klinker. She has been in the Indiana State Senate for 38 years. Every single frickin' event there is, she's there. Like, it is her job to be at every event and smile at people, and no one hates her. Like, she's a Democrat in one of the most Republican districts in Tippecanoe County, and she gets reelected every year. I don't know how she does it. What a great way to be a writing program administrator or respond to writing, right? Everybody loves you. What about a martial arts instructor? Yeah, so again, if we're imagining ourselves as a firefighter when we're talking about writing program administration, which I'm sure you've done, right? I do it too. What are the metaphors we take to responding? Are we a coach? Are we a paramedic? Are we a minister? Are we a counselor? Right? Yeah, so thinking about the personas that you sort of have in your head while you're responding to writing, I think, can really help. What are the metaphors we bring to responding? How are those metaphors welcoming? How are those metaphors encouraging? How are they facilitating? All right. We've heard people talk about conquering a mountain of grading. Is your metaphor a mountain climber? What does that project? I think if we shape these positively, it can really help. So this is the second activity to think about. What are the metaphors that you might use to shape your responding to student writing? What metaphors are welcoming, intimidating, engaging, demanding, confusing? How do these metaphors position you in relation to your students? How do they position your students in relation to each other, to the institution? Right? I mean, a lot of our students have a very instrumental view of their education. Right? I mean, their metaphor is a transaction. Right? They want to go to college for very specific career-related reasons. Okay, fine. What does that leave out? So think about this for a minute or so, and then let's talk about it. Let's throw some metaphors out on the table. Again, you guys in the Zoom, you can just drop them in the chat. All right, so Derek is the first volunteer. Harried guidance counselor was what he wrote. I went back to this page in case it might help you think about some of the metaphors that you might use. Any ideas?
I don't want to be the only one that But actually, your activities in 594 last year led me to the personal trainer metaphor.
Mm-hmm.
I used to be a personal trainer, and that kind of scaffolding
Mm-hmm.
really applies to that, as well as the different genres.
Mm-hmm.
Writing in different genres can be compared to writing to participating in different fitness activities. Swimming isn't the same as powerlifting. It's
Yeah.
the same as
Right.
long distance running.
Yeah, what's nice, so Cecilia is talking about the metaphor of a personal trainer and emphasizing that there's lots of different ways you can exercise, and so there's lots of different ways to write. And so that's a nice metaphor because it's not projecting one type of writing, one genre, one discipline, right? All that stuff that could be problematic about some understanding of student writing. Yeah, any other ones that you might think about?
Chiropractor?
Okay, chiropractor. Interesting. Let's hear it.
Well, because it's got the same sort of training aspect of, personal trainer, but it's also about sort of responding to what's there and unique in the person. And sometimes I worry that maybe there isn't a real science behind it, but it works as a practice.
No, see, that's perfect. That's perfect because you have to work with the positive and the negative or weird dimensions of the metaphor, right? Is chiropractic really science? Is it really like your whole body going through the spine, right? Go ahead.
Sometimes like a mechanic.
Yeah.
Trying to figure out, like, sometimes you look at a piece and you're like,
Right.
what's wrong?
Right.
What's wrong? And well, if you change this and you don't change this, what happens? Right? Like, so you're thinking about all those parts and how they work together and which one to encourage the student to start with, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Kyle, and there's one in the chat.
I like that you listed earnest listener. I tend to think of my work as a responder, as a curious listener, especially in the early drafting component, because there are times when I think the student's still trying to work out what they want to say, and sometimes they just need an open-ended question that says, I can see you're trying to do something really interesting here, but I'm not quite sure what that is. Can you write more?
Yeah.
Can you tell me more about this? And that sometimes solve some of the initial obvious mechanical problems that exist within the text itself.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that because, again, you're really zooming in on that one word, earnest versus curious versus intentional, right? There's lots of different adjectives we could use for that, and they're all a little different, right? So my point here isn't that you've got to pick the one that's right. It's thinking through them, and, in the same way that rhetorical choices shape writing, your choices about the metaphor that's going to guide your responding at certain times is going to help you do a better job, and it's going to help you stay directed and stay focused and make those decisions. What do I do with this weird paper? Right? What do I do with the student that I think plagiarized for the second time? Right? Well, what's the appropriate character or persona that I need right now? In the chat, sometimes librarian. Boy, isn't it great to have awesome librarians that can help us in our job? Seriously, the day we go to the library and they help you with the databases, I love that. I still love that. So yeah, again, think about some of these and try out some ones for different contexts. Think about how they can be productive. But the goal here is the welcoming bit, right? So notice this is plural. What metaphors, personas, plural, can and should we project in providing feedback and designing writing assignments that are welcoming to our students? Okay. Here's being more directive about my first less is more argument. And again, this comes from my work with Harry Denny, and if you've worked in a writing center, this is familiar territory. You've got a paper in front of you. What are 2 or 3 things you can say about it that are positive? What are 2 or 3 things you can give the student to work on? Or really the writer to work on, because this works for non-students too. Right? And knowing why. Knowing why is important, because if you're going to have a conversation with the student about it on down the road, that's going to help. Knowing why is also important if you're grading 100 papers. Because again, it helps you move more quickly and more confidently and not second guess. Have you ever done that thing where you start and you're going through a bunch of stuff and you get about halfway through it and you want to go back to the beginning because you're afraid you've missed something? And you're like, well, I'm already halfway there. So part of this is about our confidence, right? But I go back to this over and over again. I don't want to just say less is more. I want to be a little more directive, especially for new folks. And for anybody, right? 2 or 3 things, positive, negative. Right? Yes, Samantha, I would do a compliment sandwich. I'm sure folks have heard of this before. I've heard of this before. I love this idea. I would do a compliment sandwich with the middle revision suggestion being ideally something global that can apply not only to this paper, but future writing as well. Yes, Samantha is anticipating things I'm going to say later, so that's great. Thank you. Absolutely. You're thinking long and short term a little bit at the same time. Okay, yeah, compliment sandwich. So then your metaphor is clearly the sandwich shop, right? Well, I want to be a little more high-end than Subway. Actually, no. Sometimes Subway is just what you need. Sometimes you don't need a shishi sandwich. All right. So I'm looking at the time. We're going to skip this. We'll come back to this later. Quick summary and then a short break. So 4 things. More feedback's not always more helpful or more engaging. I strongly recommend you look at McIntyre's suggestions for responding inclusively. Draw the ones that make the most sense for you. Think about the metaphors for responding and how they shape your responding to student writing. And then your go-to for less is more should be identifying a small number of strengths and a small number of weaknesses that are both short-term and long-term. Okay, let's get to workload. So I'm going to start with a prescription for managing your workload. But I want to present this prescription, with a caveat. I want you to feel confident in taking this prescription and modifying it for your own purpose. I'll suggest that you give it a shot, because I've used this method a lot and taught it a lot, and it works pretty well. So I'm just going to run through the whole thing, and then we'll talk about it. So the first thing I think is really important if you have no matter what your workload is in responding to writing, but especially if your workload's heavy, put time in your calendar as you plan your courses. I have a stack of assignments coming in for a graduate class on Friday. I have time in the calendar for it. Monday plus time on the plane. The second one, these are the most 2 important things in my mind. Read all the student work before you start to make comments. This changed my responding life. People will say, Dilger, doesn't that take more time? No, it saves you time. Because what it lets you do is it lets you do these things. It lets you think about sorting out the work into different types of, we used to do this on paper, right? So you could literally put them in piles, different patterns that you see in the work, patterns that might arise from misunderstanding of the assignment or misunderstanding of the genre or, the context. It helps you think about if you need to make changes to any of your aids to response, like your rubrics or your instruments. It helps you think about what you don't have to say to every single student individually that you can broadcast. And then it gives you a little time to reflect. Right? If this stuff comes in on Thursday and you read it on Friday, and you get the weekend to think about it before you start responding on Monday, I think that's brilliant. It's helped me a ton. Piles, I put an asterisk on because, of course, many of us don't do paper anymore. We're grading almost all online, using, I think you guys use Canvas here. Boy, thank goodness. We use Brightspace, and it is a steaming heap of doggy-doo. I mean, it is terrible. I got to use Canvas this summer at the Dartmouth seminar when I went up there to help them with their research seminar for a week, and my goodness, I just walked in and started using it. Brightspace, I'm still trying to figure out how to use the darn thing. Anyway, so for online stuff, what I tend to do is I tend to make a spreadsheet. And I tend to put notes in columns in the spreadsheet. And I might have different columns in the spreadsheet, but then I can use filters to see the different types of work that we're dealing with. And so those are the virtual piles. All right, so second page of the prescription. Start with the student work that needs the most improvement. Okay? And there's 2 reasons for this. The first is you can return, when students just misunderstand the assignment, if there's a suspected issue with academic integrity, if there's just some glitch, like they did a double space when it's supposed to be single spaced or vice versa, right? That can be an innocent mistake. Sometimes the response is, you know what, I'm not going to give you feedback on this because either you need to try again, or we need to talk, or we've got to talk. And in my opinion, getting this stuff back to students as quickly as possible is going to help everybody. The other reason I like to start with stuff that needs the most improvement is you get quicker as you go. That's sort of a reward to yourself. Instead of starting with the easy stuff and then dreading it and dreading it and dreading it, it gets easier as you go. So you're going downhill, not uphill. Second thing here, using a timer to limit response time per student. Do the math. I think a lot of you guys who are instructors teach 5 loads, right? You have 100 students. How much time does it take if you give every student 10 minutes of paper versus 20 versus 15, et cetera? Do the math. And I will say the math doesn't have to be equal per student. Some students need more time from you. Some students need less. That's okay. All right? Again, we talked about this before, identifying a small number of strengths and weaknesses. Next, connecting comments to readings and our students' previous work. I think the first of these is really, really important. We see over and over again on student evaluations, a complaint that I see is I had to buy a textbook and we never used it. This also helps with authority. This also helps with the way that you project your response in relation to assignments. Okay? Deliver comments immediately. Don't wait to do all 100 or all however many it is. Just push them out as they go. That's okay. Because again, what we don't want is a situation where you think you have to sit down and spend a 12-hour day responding to get everything to one group of students at once. No. Get the feedback to the people who need it the most as soon as possible. Right? I guess the metaphor here is the emergency room, right? Triage. Okay? And then finally, reinforce what you say about feedback individually and for students in class. And of course, by class, I could mean discussion boards or announcements or things like that. Right? So if you're in a face-to-face class, it's easy to say to a student afterwards, wow, you did a great job on that last assignment. If you're emailing with a student or chatting with them in online office hours, you can do the same thing. In announcements or discussions, you can say, hey, so-and-so did a really great job, or this team did a really nice job on that. Or, oh, you guys are doing really well using these rubrics that I've asked you to use. So again, consistent messaging really helps. Okay. So here are some tricks of the trade. Many of these you've probably heard of. If not, I want to share them with you. Rubrics, checklists, whatever you like. I think the most important thing here is keeping it sweet and simple. If it takes you longer to read the rubric than it does to read the paper, it's probably too long. So there's a million places you can go online to find these. NCT has nice resources. Megan McIntyre, who I showed you before, has nice resources. This is the kind of stuff you can get from people in your program, right? If you're working together, last suggestion. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but this is the key. Don't overcomplicate it. The simpler, the better. And in that regard, the describe, evaluate, suggest heuristic that is part of Eli Review that Bill Hart-Davidson has made famous, which actually comes from Janice Lauer at Purdue, we think. Yeah, describe what you see, evaluate it, make a suggestion. Okay? So if you use that heuristic for your 2 comments that you're going to ask students to improve, again, you're in a mindset where you can keep the structure and be efficient. And also, maybe recycle some of this stuff, which is the next point, use a comment bank. Right? Can you cut if you're saying the same thing, say the same thing. That's okay. Again, I tell students this. You know what? If you compare, you're going to see the exact same language. That's okay. All right? If you share the entire comment bank, then students can read the comment bank, use it in conjunction with your rubric or your checklist, and they can think about things that you've said to other students but not to them, and think if that applies to their work as well, both the positive and the negative. Try contract or specs grading. Again, a million ways to do this. Your colleague Dr. Inouye has written some really good books about it. There's tons online. Megan McIntyre has good stuff on various ways to do this. Dr. Powell uses specs grading in a really amazing way. It's helped me focus on the feedback, not on the numbers. And that's what I like the most about it, is because the feedback is where the action is. And then finally, try grading groups or feedback festivals or responding roundtables or whatever alliterative name you can come up with. Right? It's amazing how much easier it is to do this when you're in a room with somebody and you can say, can you take a look at this? And that room can be face-to-face or online. Think about what infrastructure supports your feedback. Susan Lee Starr said infrastructure is only visible when it's broken. Sometimes people feel like they have to have a lot of infrastructure to support feedback and to, do the writing class thing. Oh, it's a writing class, we got to have peer review. Well, what if your peer review isn't so great? Right? What if peer review is just one more thing you've asking students to do? Is your infrastructure broken? Does it help? Okay? I think it's better to do a small amount of things that tie very, very specifically to what you're doing and do them very, very well than to, again, we're in the same situation of overwhelming students with too much. Okay? So if you're asking students to do experiential learning in group conferences, well, maybe you're not going to be asking them to do some of this other stuff too. Designing assignments for response. All right, and again, I've tried to put these in order. I think the first 2 are the most important. Assign the shortest possible length of assignment you can. I once taught a graduate class in research methods where it was all one-pagers and a poster. And on the first day of class, I overheard one student say to another, "I thought Dilger was a hard ass. This class is only one-pagers?" Yeah. Then they had to describe 5 years of work in 500 words. Right? Harder or shorter is not necessarily easier. Shorter can be harder. But it's easier for us because if we're only asking students to do the minimum that they need to do to show the objectives, it's less work for us. So always go as short as you can. This next one is probably the most important one. Test your assignments with other readers before you distribute them to students. Do the assignment yourself. Ask a colleague to do the assignment. Test the rubrics or the checklist. Do they work? Does your math add up? Yep. How many of you have done that before, right? Your math and your rubric doesn't add up. Yeah, that's no fun. Take your assignments to the Writing Center to get feedback from them. Again, you can see my collaboration with Dr. Denny here, right? Like they'll sit down and they'll go over the assignment with you and talk about what they see in it. It's a form of testing. So you can make sure that the thing is going to work before 80 people see it. You can see my user experience and technical communication background there. I won't read the rest of these in depth. Just the high points here, because I do want to end with a little time for reflection. Describe your approaches to providing feedback. Talk about it. Put it in your assignments. Put it in your classes. Right? Again, communicate your expectations. What do you want students to do with the feedback? Okay, and how do you structure it in a way that makes it work? All right, so I wanted to end with time for questions, and we have about 10 minutes. So if you have a question, either in real life or in Zoom life, I shouldn't say real life, in person or in Zoom, well, that doesn't work either. Okay, and never mind, I'm going to stop digging myself a hole and just invite anybody to raise their hand and ask a question here or online, and we'll talk about it. All right, Samantha has a nice comment here that I want to share because it is spot on. I've been on this journey for several years and have picked up a lot of little tricks, such as using a timer, keeping suggestions to a minimum, etc. However, what drags me down is the emotional and mental energy exertion. Yes, there is so much to take into account, where the student is in terms of growth, how well will they take feedback, etc. After 5 or so papers, my brain becomes mush and I have a hard time making good judgment calls or paying close attention to students' writing. How do you approach the mental and emotional effort of grading? Yeah, thank you for asking this. This is super challenging, and it's not easy at all. For me, the act of reading all the work ahead of time really helps me because it helps me see the path. If I have 80 papers to grade and I'm getting worn out after 5 or 10 papers, all I can think about is 80 minus 10 is 70, and what those 70 other papers look like. This is another reason why I do so much stuff collaboratively, right? Because I can turn to people that I trust and ask them for help, and they can do the same for me. And then this is also why, a lot of folks turn to structures like rubrics or checklists, because they lift some of the work off of you directly and shift them a little bit to the instrument. I don't think there's any magic bullet for this. I think you have to combine a couple different strategies in that regard. And I don't want to sound flip when I say this, but also know the limits of what we do. We're teaching a required course that students take, and some of them take and leave. So we want to do the best we can for our students, but some of them, their investment is varied. Samantha, if you want to respond to that, I'd be happy to try to engage that if you want to try speaking out loud or chatting more. And of course, you guys are welcome to respond too.
So this is a luxury, I know, but I think it's dead on that 5 papers is about the limit for most people. I almost never grade more than 5 papers at a time. I don't have time for grading marathons because there's so much else going on. So I can do 5 papers in half an hour, and so that's what I'll do, and then I'll do something else and pick up the next 5 papers at another spot. But to do more than, my limit is probably 7 or 8, but to do more than that, I can't, so I don't try it anymore.
Yeah. So here's also when the length can be important too. That the shorter you make the thing, the easier it is to get it done.
Do that.
I also think that's when the sort of sorting, so you're working with the same type of papers if they sort of follow categories. Again, because you can do more at once because you're kind of doing the same thing. My mom was a grade school teacher for a long time, and she did a lot of like small assignments with students, and she would grade 4 of them at a time. She had 4 pieces of paper and she'd put them out on the table, and I'm like, how do you do that? And she's like, well, it helps you see the differences. Now, I'm not suggesting that we grade 4 papers at a time, but if you're grading, like all the students who had a really hard time with the remediation part of an assignment, or all the students who had they're doing some research methods and they had a really hard part with the specific method, those students are getting similar comments, right? You're pointing them in similar directions. That can help you. All right, another comment that I want to share, and I'll do what I did before. Do it here. This is from Soo-Yeon Kim. I always try to make my comments shorter, but it's not easy if the student's paper needs a lot of improvements. Would you please give us advice on how we can handle this issue? Yes, thank you. Another excellent question. You just have to be careful and rank the things you want to help students with. So this is when I encourage you to go back to those outcomes. And to think about what your class is supposed to do. What's the arc of the semester? Where are you in that arc of the semester? What's the most important 2 or 3 things for that student right now? Right? Knowing that there's a lot more, that's okay, right? Especially if they're cause and effect. If you give a student 10 things to do and they do 1 of them, that's not going to help. If you give them 2 things to do and they do 2 of them, that's a big step. Because then they can say in their head, I've done it all. I've done both the things. Now what? Okay, so again, this is a case where, for me, looking sort of across the set of work that I'm dealing with can help me make decisions about which of those things is the biggest priority. And I pass it down the hall. I ask people to help me. Yeah, so Aaron, thank you, Aaron, for responding to Soo-Yeon's question, I believe. I put a lot into the drafts, reading and giving feedback. By the time they submit the final draft, I know what each student is submitting, and it makes grading a bit easier. Yeah, that can be true also if you have assignments that scaffold pretty heavily. There can be drawbacks to having students work with similar material for the whole semester, but the main positive is the student kind of stays in one lane and you get to know that lane. Other questions or comments? All right, last slide. Thank you for asking me to share some things with you today, and thank you for having good things to say. There's my contact information. You are welcome to use it. Thank you.